Hello, everyone, and welcome to One More Podcast. Not an episode number, just a group discussion. I've been calling them Multitap so far. I don't know if that's what the official name's going to be, but that's been what I've been calling them at this point. This is a podcast that's going to be about Gun Gun Pixies. This is it was a PlayStation Vita game. I think it released in like 2015 or sometime back then. But it recently, about last year, it came out on the Switch with an English localization. And it's from a developer called Shade, and they're kind of a developer with a history. So I went ahead and decided to bring on Pete Davison with MoeGamer.net to the podcast. Hi, Pete. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Thanks. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks. And you actually wrote like a full history of Shade at some point. So I was kind of curious, like, what exactly got you into their games? Like, what was the particular game you started with them, and why you kind of continued to explore their games over time?
Yeah, sure. So, for those of you not familiar with my site, MoeGamer, what I tend to do as a format is I do what I call a cover game feature, which is where I pick a game or series and then I explore that in great detail over the course of usually 4 or 5 articles. But at the time of recording, I'm actually doing the whole Atelier series, so this is going to be a very long-term feature. But yeah, for Gun Gun Pixies and also a game which I covered alongside it called Bullet Girls Fantasia. They specifically attracted my attention because of the developer. And I forget the original context in which I sort of discovered who Shade were, but I think it was when Gun Gun Pixies was first announced. And I thought, that name Shade sounds familiar. Where have I heard that before? And I went and did a bit of research and fell down a bit of a rabbit hole, as you do. And I do that a lot. But yeah, I discovered that Shade is a company that's actually been around in one form or another for quite a long time. And they have their origins in another company from the 16-bit home console era known as Quintet. And Quintet were the company who made ActRaiser, is probably their most well-known one for Super NES. And then they went on to make what's known as the Heaven and Earth trilogy, which is Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, and Terranigma. So those are all very sort of well-regarded games on the Super NES era. And then as far as most people were concerned, Quintet sort of fell off the face of the planet after that. A lot of people don't really make the connection between Quintet and what they did a bit later. But one game that I was very fond of in the PlayStation 1 era was a role-playing game called the Grandstream Saga, which it turns out was developed by Shade, and it's the sort of unofficial 4th installment in the Heaven and Earth trilogy, so it's a successor to Terranigma in a lot of ways. And then Shade then went on to do Orphan, Scion of Sorcery, which is one of the, I think it was a launch PS2 game, and certainly one of the first games I played on PS2. And most recently, they've made the Bullet Girls series and Gun Gun Pixies. And I just thought that was a really interesting trajectory for a developer to take. And the fact that they sort of disappeared as far as most people were concerned at the end of the Super NES era, but in fact, they're still doing stuff today in one form or another.
Do you know when the change in name happened, like between, when Shade itself was founded, between like Quintet and when they switched over to Shade as a developer?
Yeah, it was shortly after Terranigma. So Terranigma came out, and then what happened was the graphic designer Koji Yokota left Quintet to form his own development company, and he took a bunch of Quintet people with him, including one of the Quintet co-founders, Tomoyoshi Miyazaki, who had written the 3 Heaven and Earth games. So he'd taken some sort of really key staffers with him to form Shade. So basically, Shade was the core of Quintet. Quintet did carry on and do a few things until the early 2000s. So they did a PS2 adaptation of the Inuyasha manga and anime. I think that was the last thing they did. But yeah, they sort of quietly disappeared after that, but Shade carried on doing things from there.
Gun Gun Pixies was really the first time I had even noticed the developer's name, but when I was aware of Quintet. I've actually only ever played ActRaiser of that old series of games, but actually when I was looking at their developer credentials previously, I saw they actually made Onslaught, which is a WiiWare shooter that was published by Hudson Soft. And it's kind of weird because I looked at Onslaught and then I looked at Bullet Girls, and there's actually quite a few similarities of being like kind of a wave-based shooters. And then I don't know if Bullet Girl Fantasia has this, but at least Bullet Girls 2 has like these little tents where like characters keep spawning out of. And there's just like you have to sit there and shoot them till they explode, and it's like a weird amount of health that they have, and it's like Onslaught is the exact same thing of just shooting at this thing for way too long. But yeah, Onslaught was kind of a weird thing, but it was kind of surprising to see how Bullet Girls Fantasia and Bullet Girls kind of reminded me so much of that older WiiWare shooter they did. So that was kind of my history with it, but I definitely don't have the breadth and depth of it that you have. I would really recommend people go read your history article on Shade. I'll definitely link it in the podcast notes for that. But Gun Gun Pixies is kind of I would say a very different game than their other shooters that they made with Bullet Girls. It has shooter elements to it, but it's to me it's more of an adventure game in a lot of ways. Because a lot of it is exploration focused, and I guess you could say it's kind of puzzle solving to some extent. Not really. It's I guess it might make more sense to like talk about the structure of the game first. You're basically these little pixie girls, and you go around these rooms, and there's these giant or normal sized girl dorms, I guess, or girls in the dorm basically, and they're basically there to study these people. But as things go wrong and like disrupt the dorm life, they have to investigate these problems that show up and try to resolve them so they can observe a normal girl in the dorm life basically. And so shooting the girls is almost like an information finding part of the game initially, because really what you do is you like shoot them in their different body parts, and when you do that, it makes them talk about their problems, if I recall correctly. It's actually been a little bit since I played this, but yeah, and so you like do that part where you kind of get information from all the different girls about this issue they've run into, and then you explore the environment in a very kind of like Chibi Robo kind of way of like jumping around the furniture, getting on dresser drawers and things like that. And then finally, once you found the issue, at some point there's like these squids that show up, and you kind of just have to kill them randomly if just in your way, or sometimes they'll be like, hey, kill all these, and then you can move on in the objective. Story-wise, it culminates into like a critical point in some way where like, oh, this girl who has been on a diet is starving herself essentially, and she basically goes crazy with this, and you basically shoot her to shoot some sense into her in some ways. Yeah.
So sort of the narrative context of all that is that the pixies are armed with what they call happy bullets, which are basically attempts to sort of release endorphins and that sort of thing and make people feel more relaxed. So those boss battles are framed as sort of the girls are really wound up and tense about something that's been really bothering them or something, and bit by bit you're sort of relaxing them and encouraging them to sort of think about things from a more detached and rational perspective and that sort of thing. One thing I think that's worth considering with regard to Gun Gun Pixies is actually something that is fairly common with Japanese developers who are working on the more sort of low budget side of things and kind of flying under the radar a bit. And that is that they tend to get a bit more experimental with game structure and what we regard as the traditional balance between gameplay and story. And Gun Gun Pixies is actually a really good example of that, I think. So Gun Gun Pixies is a game that kind of it looks like a third-person shooter, but as you say, it's really not a third-person shooter. It's not the same kind of game as the Bullet Girl series. And there have been lots of different examples of this sort of game over the years. So some things that I've covered in the past on MoeGamer include there's a game called Atelier the Eternal, which is it's a strategy RPG, but the first 6 hours of it are a slice of life high school visual novel. And then it just completely goes absolutely crazy after that initial sequence. And then there's a lot of particularly early visual novels that disguise their core nature as a linear narrative with adventure game and puzzle mechanics. So if you look back at a lot of early Eroge in particular, stuff like Nocturnal Illusion and Three Sisters Story and that sort of thing, those are presented like adventure games. So like you have a bunch of verbs you can click on and a bunch of hotspots you can click on. They're still visual novels, but they provide the illusion of interactivity through these sort of game-like mechanics, I guess. And Gun Gun Pixies is basically doing the same thing with its action sequences. So they're not the focus of the game at all, but they are a means to an end. They're a means to explore the story. They're a means to explore the world a bit. But the main point of Gun Gun Pixies, which I think a fair few people missed in their reviews of it, is the story side of things. It's basically a visual novel that is punctuated by these action sequences.
Yeah, and they kind of do an interesting way of mixing the two because, you are these tiny pixie girls, but so there's like a pixie girls from space, essentially. So there's like a sci-fi angle to it to some extent. Like, kind of the main backdrop of this game is that, like, buildings are being taken away, and, like, what ultimately it ends up being is that they're being, like, shrunken and taken. So there's, like, this weird technology that, normally wouldn't be used in a normal, real world situation, but the actual story regarding the characters is all very grounded. It's all about these relationships these characters have, and all the problems that they face are in relation to their own interpersonal things, not really anything to do with the sci-fi part. They do kind of, meet at some point at the very end, but a lot of it is coming down to, I feel like, acceptance is a big part of it.
Yes,
like accepting,
definitely.
Your body. There's a particular story between some of the sisters at the end that I think is actually really good. It's kind of about whether or not blood is important in some way, which I kind of like. And how they present that is, I'd say, different than most other games that kind of deal with that kind of, like, I don't know if adoption is the right word, but, like, bringing somebody into your family who isn't actually a part of your family kind of thing. One thing I do like about this game is I like smart use of space in games. So basically, I'm not a big fan of open world games usually because I feel like it's a lot of wasted space in games.
Yeah, same.
And Gun Gun Pixies is very, very focused. If I recall correctly, it's just 3 rooms.
Yeah, that's right.
Throughout the entire game. And I think overall, they probably could have more variety to these rooms. They do kind of change the environment a little bit. I remember there's some things that move around, but it's very, very light. But what I like what this does is it kind of makes you learn the best paths to get around a room. Because there's a lot of, like, I don't know if this is really a fun part of the game, but there's a lot of money collection in the game. Every time you enter a room, you can go and collect all the money. And, if you get enough money, it, like, basically ranks you at the end based off your time, how much of these flying coins you collect in the environment. And it's a little repetitive, but a lot of it feels very almost like a speedrun mentality of, I'm going to find the most effective way to collect these coins every time I come back to this room, kind of thing. And I like that focused design of the level structure quite a bit.
I think if we sort of kind of branch out our perspective to thinking about other media as well, I think a lot of people sort of assume that video games, they should always be moving forwards and moving on and that sort of thing. But if we think of sort of other storytelling media, it's not at all uncommon for films and stage plays in particular to take place in a very limited environment. And I think to a certain extent, that's one of the things that Gun Gun Pixies is trying to do. It's trying to give you a very sort of strong feeling of attachment to this place and of understanding why it's important to the characters. And by limiting those environments for you to explore, yes, it does make the game a bit more limited, and yes, you are sort of doing the same things over and over a bit, but you get to know those areas really well. You get to know all the little nooks and crannies of where they hide things, and yeah, you get really attached to the environment in that. And I think it's sort of the same kind of reason that some films take a very tight focus on a couple of characters, and a lot of stage plays use either very abstract or completely absent sets sometimes.
In thinking about how that space is so focused, one thing I do wish they did a little better was maybe create a greater challenge within that space, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One thing that, it isn't focused on the shooting part of the game, that's for sure. And some of the sections aren't really, intended to be challenges. Like, I think there's these squid viruses that appear, and every time they show up, they kind of just kind of sit there and they spin a little bit. They kind of attack you, but not really.
Yeah.
They're more just target practice. And if you look at like Bullet Girls 2 in particular, that game is fairly similar. Of just like a lot of the characters just like stand around and you basically just go and shoot them. Which with Bullet Girls Fantasia, it seems like everything kind of chases you in that game, and more of like a wave based kind of thing. But yeah, it does become, and same with like, collecting money and stuff, it does become a little mindless in that regard of just like shooting these little squids and stuff. They're cute. But there are some ones where it's like, and this kind of, works into moving around the space again. There are some where it's like, hey, you need to kill all these squids in the environment. And so there is like periods of time where you have to kind of find these nook and crannies of the room that aren't typically, you don't typically go across. So like you'll find a little squid like in the little tiny corner on the top of the room. You have to find these like warp doors. It's like all the little outlets in the room where they, power outlets. They're like almost act as warp points and stuff, and they spit you out at different parts of the map. And so there's a little bit of like puzzling out that kind of pathfinding in it as well. And then during the I guess what you'd call the major selling point of this game, the parts where you're actually shooting the girls, the boss fights, it's challenging in some ways because I guess it's probably good to describe how the boss fights work in the first place. Is basically the girl is in the room doing like a series of actions, and then while they're doing these actions, like different, I guess you'd call them like emotions that almost like fall off of their body in some ways that act as projectiles. So it's like, here's the depression emotion falling out of them. It's like these purple balls that just roll across the floor. And then like the tears will like shoot at you like a machine gun from the eyes. It's kind of a strange mechanic of the game. And as time goes on with like, I think there's probably a dozen or so of these fights, if I recall correctly, because I think some of the girls you do it multiple times with. As you go on, these like projectiles become more and more numerous, and with how the environment works in that game and how the camera can get like stuck in the environment, it can be a little difficult to dodge all that stuff. But yeah, so you're basically dodging these things while you're shooting individual parts of their body. So things like their hands, their arms, their boobs, their butt, things like that. And then once you max all those out, that's essentially, max out the meter on them as you shoot them with happy bullets. That's kind of considered the win state. And unfortunately, I think that part of the game kind of is trivialized a little bit because there's like these little power points on the floor that you can use to like power up your shots. So it like encourages you to go to like specific locations to shoot these girls. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but they're also healing points. So you can kind of like stick on top of them and just keep shooting. And then if they hit you, it's not really like a big deal. You can basically just heal yourself again. But I do really like those bottle components because I don't really know of anything else that plays quite like that, in terms of, having to kind of find different places in the environment to best shoot this girl, from different angles and stuff like that. And that's kind of also, worked into navigating the room, because then you can find like the best places to sit there and like shoot them with the happy bullets and stuff like that.
Yeah, the closest equivalents I can think of are there's Demolition Girl on PlayStation 2, in which you're fighting a giant woman in a helicopter. You're in the tiny helicopter and she's a giant woman stomping around.
It's a Simple series.
Yeah, that's right. That's that's probably one of the most well-known ones in the Simple series. And then there's also Mr. Mosquito, also on PS2 as well, which is a very similar sort of idea to this. So you're a tiny thing in a normal size environment, and there's people in there, and you've got to do things to the people. So those are sort of the closest equivalents I can think to this. I actually found after a while that although what you say with the super points is correct, what I actually found after a while is just using the rapid fire guns and sort of running around actually proved more effective than sitting in one place, because you can still get hit while you're on those super points. You can just heal yourself.
Yeah.
But if you keep moving and shooting with the rapid fire gun, then you can actually get the encounter done with just your normal shots almost more quickly in some cases. So you actually don't have to use them at all. And yeah, the design could be a bit better in some places, but I mean, as we've sort of already talked about, these action sequences are almost incidental to the main story. So
yeah, and like I definitely, like, towards the end of the game, definitely stopped using those points nearly as much because of the rapid fire thing.
Yeah.
That's for sure. There's like the single shotguns. Were you ever able to get those single shotguns to be useful for anything, or the ones?
No, never. Never.
I tried it once, and it was the longest boss fight I ever had, because even when they're powered up, they just take like 30 billion years. So obviously, Gun Gun Pixies is a very suggestive game in a lot of ways. So one thing we kind of haven't really talked about is as you shoot these girls, they essentially like get all flustered looking, blushing, and their eyes are like rolling back in their head and things like that. Very suggestive in the way you would expect it to be. But I think what's kind of interesting about the game is that even though that sexual presentation is a big part of this game, it uses its sexuality to almost like build a different focus of the game that you typically have. Like, something I try to think about is what is Gun Gun Pixies without the sexual elements kind of thing. And to some extent, I think you could look at that game and say, it doesn't necessarily need that extra flair of the girls essentially orgasming at that point. But at the same time, I also don't know how you come to the conclusion of the design of Gun Gun Pixies. And I think what I mean by that is one game I've always really liked that kind of is a good mix of like sexual gameplay and mechanics is Aquacube, because Aquacube is basically this puzzler game where you have to go underwater and solve these puzzles, and you're saving your sibling, and so you're like underwater, and while they're underwater they're drowning, but one thing you can do is go and basically deliver oxygen to them by going doing mouth to mouth and giving them oxygen. But the mechanics of the game actually change when you swap. So you're originally the brother, and you're going and giving oxygen to the girl, and then it will actually swap in the second half of the game where the brother's underwater, but the girl's giving the brother air, and the brother gets very excited by his sister, and so it makes him consume oxygen faster. So it changes the mechanic of the game of when you give him oxygen, it's like only 10 seconds worth of oxygen, and if you give him any oxygen before he is even close to that low amount, it actually is instant death basically, because he can't survive longer after that. So I thought that was like a really cool part of the game that was like informed by the sexual preference of the character. And so Gun Gun Pixies I don't feel like really has that. But in terms of like the dorm style storytelling, like this story about these college girls in the dorm and their personal relationships, I don't know if you'd ever like come to that conclusion if you were making something that was not based around this concept.
I think part of it in the case of Gun Gun Pixies is, as you say, the dorm focus is you're seeing these girls not at their best in a lot of cases. So you're seeing these girls, they're not going out, they're not trying to sort of present themselves in a glamorous way to anyone. They're just hanging out at home. And that means that they're sort of wearing their frumpy pajamas and sort of wandering around and just sort of doing things that they do when they think no one's watching and that sort of thing. And I think that sort of unglamorous side of things ties in with the sexual side of things as well, because in a lot of ways, by playing the part of the Pixies, you're sort of acting as a bit of a voyeur on these girls' lives. And that's sort of the whole point. They're supposed to be observing what these girls are doing and how their interpersonal relationships work and that sort of thing. And I think part of understanding that is recognizing and being honest about the fact that people aren't always glamorous, people aren't always sort of perfect at all times, and that sort of thing. And I think it's more a sort of presentational side of things that relates to the narrative rather than anything that particularly ties in with the gameplay as such.
Yeah, and I think the point I'm kind of trying to make with that is that, like, I don't think this game exists without that at the same time, though. Like, even though it's tied into the presentation, and not so much the mechanics of the game, this game wouldn't exist in the way it exists without that.
Yes,
that part.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I do think, and this is more of a little personal peeve of mine, is one thing that I do think the sexual element does kind of take away from the game is the clothing in it. I don't know how you feel about clothing in games, Pete, but I love clothing in games.
Yeah, same.
And there is a lot of underwear in this game. If
Yes.
you love lingerie, you'll be into this. Some of it not even lingerie. It's like a lot of like chocolate drops and stuff on their body and things like that. But I remember Schoolgirl Zombie Hunters is another game that I had this problem with. It was like, basically, as far as I could tell, there's really only 2, at least easy to get outfits for the girls in Gun Gun Pixies, for the Pixies specifically.
Yeah.
And then everything else is underwear. and it's nice that, when, as you take damage and stuff, your clothes rip off. So you do see the underwear. But I would say most of the time in this game, you're not really taking much damage. Except for like if you're doing the boss fight and like standing on that super powered point or something like that and just like eating the hits while you recover. So I do feel like the underwear is a little underutilized because it's almost always covered up. Although it does do the thing where if you crawl on the ground, you basically just get the straight shot right up their skirts. And it's like there's no way to avoid it. That is just what you're staring at while you're playing this.
That made some people really angry when they reviewed it. It was hilarious.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. I shouldn't be surprised. But yeah. So I feel kind of conflicted about that, but I think that's that on the same side though. If somebody was into lingerie and stuff like that, they probably would be pretty happy with Gun Gun Pixies.
Yeah.
In that regard.
I think one nice thing is when you beat it, you get to change some of the costumes on the large girls as well. So you get to sort of swap their costumes around and that sort of thing. That's quite a nice touch, I think. But yeah, it could do with maybe a few more costumes. And there are a few bits of DLC, but from what I can tell, most of them are just sort of swapping the heads on the main characters to make them look like the other girls.
Yeah.
But last time I looked, anyway, it's been a while since I looked, but last time I looked, I don't think there were any actual other costumes for them.
Was that DLC actually DLC on the Switch version, or was that only Vita is downloadable?
Yeah, you can get it on the eShop.
Okay, gotcha. I thought that I was thinking maybe it would be included already, since I think because the game originally came out in like 2015, right?
That's right.
The Vita. So yeah. So one thing that actually was kind of fun in this game too is it's published by Combile Heart, and so Neptunia and what's her name? Noir.
Yeah.
Is that her name? I have not played many Neptunia games. I think I've played Blanc versus Zombie, and that's literally it. But I was kind of surprised because whenever the game came out on Vita, they actually showed that there was the crossover into the game, but they're actually worked into the story as like a pretty, I guess, major part of the story, you could say. They're kind of a big part of what resolves the end conflict of the game. There's this whole like thing where Neptunia leaves her save data that gets deleted or something. You have to restore her save data and stuff like that. It's a fun little thing. I was surprised just like how much they built that into the game. I was expecting it to just be like, in the extra mission section, you could go do this. So I thought that was really fun. Yeah,
they worked it quite nicely into the story as well, because what Neptune and Noir are basically doing in the chapter that focuses on them is they're basically doing the same thing as the 2 Pixies are doing, but with the other girls sort of aware of their existence. So they're also observing what these girls are up to and how they exist and how they live together and that sort of thing. But the other girls are aware of them, unlike the Pixies. So yeah, that was an interesting sort of parallel thing going on there as well.
One thing I'm curious to get your thoughts on is the 2 main characters of this game is Beaton and I think Kamepon.
That's right. Yeah.
One being kind of like bunny-ish and the other one being kind of turtle-ish, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And they're very Beaton in particular is like very, very horny. She is all excited to get in the girls' bathroom and stuff. I guess one thing to mention too is that actually there's these bath scenes. I completely forgot about this. Where you go and you like get extra money by climbing on the girls while they're in the bath. Yeah, Beaton's very, very interested in the girls and stuff. And so one thing that I was kind of curious on your thoughts is I feel like the fact that Beaton is a girl makes it a bit more acceptable how horny he is. Do you feel that that's how people feel about that? Because I feel like people joke about it more, but if it was like a guy character, I wonder if it would come off more skeevy in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot more sort of acceptance of sort of Yuri horniness in Japanese games than there is of a horny male character, even though there have been great examples of horny male characters being used to explore interesting things. So like, slight tangent, but a really interesting example that everyone misunderstands in this case is there was a game by what they called Image Epoch a while back called Time and Eternity, and the main character in that he gets murdered on his wedding day, but he gets reincarnated as this little dragon and then has to sort of solve his own murder and that sort of thing. But he is horny as anything throughout the entire game because he's trapped in this little dragon's body and he's forced to basically fly alongside his wife-to-be. And you can imagine in that situation, you got murdered on your wedding day. You can imagine the blue balls you would have at that point. and everyone kind of missed the point of that. And they were like, the protagonist's all perverted and disgusting and that sort of thing. But it's like, no, think of the situation he's in, and that's completely understandable. In the case of Gun Gun Pixies, I love Betan, and I think her horniness is it ties in with sort of the backstory of the two main characters. So sort of the backstory of the whole thing. The reason why these two pixies have been sent to Earth is because their home planet has kind of forgotten how to do interpersonal relationships, and that's causing their birth rate to decline and that sort of thing, because no one is interacting with each other if they don't need to. No one is developing relationships with one another. And Betan and Kamipon were picked for this mission because they are some of the only people on that home planet to have a genuine connection and friendship with one another. And I think Betan's horniness is an important part of that. So Betan recognizes and understands when she's attracted to someone or something, and she is willing to express that. And that is something that the people back on their home planet have forgotten how to do. They've forgotten how to understand their own desires. They've forgotten how to recognize attraction to other people. So Betan is kind of a sort of a manifestation of that side of things, and how it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's sometimes a desirable thing to recognize your own desires and to explore them and express them.
And it does take Kamipon a long time to accept that. I feel like that's kind of like the ending arc of the game, is Kamipon being kind of okay with the relationship she has with Betan, I feel like. Although it does very much do that thing at the end where like Betan's like, Kamipon, I love you. And then she's like, puts the wall up at the very end. Anyways, so yeah, cool. Well, I do like to give like a 5-minute period at the end of a podcast to talk about any game that you might feel like you don't often get a chance to talk about.
Like I mentioned earlier, I'm doing an extensive mega feature on the Atelier series at the minute. And the more recent installments in this are reasonably well known now. So sort of especially with stuff like Atelier Iris, got a lot of attention for various reasons and has been one of the more popular installments in the series. But what I've decided to do is go right back to the first ones which got localized over here, which were the PlayStation 2 games, the Atelier Iris series. Which don't get talked about a whole lot these days, but they are fascinating games, and there's a lot in these games that you can see in the modern Atelier games. I think probably the most important thing that's kind of carried across in the entire series is the feeling of world building. So a lot of Atelier games take place in a relatively small geographical area. So an Atelier Iris is no exception. So there's relatively few different areas to explore, but they are full of life. They are full of interesting non-player characters to talk to. Each of the shopkeepers has their own little side story for you to explore, and as you craft items with them and buy stuff from them, you'll advance that storyline, and they're all interconnected and that sort of thing. And yeah, it's just a wonderful way of making you really feel like you're part of a world. And it just fascinates me playing a game like this, that a game like this that has a much more sort of linear storyline and is relatively more restrictive than your average sort of open world game that you get today. Sort of like Skyrim is my go-to example for this. Skyrim has a beautifully presented world that is incredibly boring to explore because no one in Skyrim has anything interesting to say. Whereas you look at Atelier Iris, this has a handful of locations to explore, but everyone you speak to has something interesting to say. Everyone you speak to has their own personality, their own name, their own motivations and that sort of thing. And it just really goes to show that sometimes having a tight focus rather than trying to be as sprawling as possible really works to a game's benefit.
Does the scale differ quite a bit from the compared to like the PlayStation 3 releases? Because I feel like that's when the series started to get kind of a more visible cult following until, more recently.
Most Atelier games have kind of taken a sort of hub-based approach where you have kind of a main base, which is where you sort of a lot of the story happens. And most of the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 ones adopt that model where you sort of live in a particular location, you go out to different places. The PlayStation 2 games actually in some ways feel a little bit more like traditional RPGs than some of the later ones, in that you're kind of traveling around a bit more of a world, but they're still relatively small scale. So that's always sort of been Atelier's thing. Atelier's thing is never been sort of exploring an entire world. It's always been exploring a relatively small region of a world and sort of getting to know the people there and what the different towns are doing and what their specialisms are and that sort of thing. So yeah, that sort of approach has stayed fairly constant throughout the whole series.
Okay. That's one that I definitely wanted to check out, but just haven't really got around to. And I also have this really bad habit of trying to choose games that aren't necessarily the more popular ones in a series. So I've always had my eye on the DS one. I forget what it was called. Atelier Annie? Alchemist of Sarah Island?
Oh, yeah. That one's like a remake of one of the original PlayStation 1 versions, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I didn't know that. So that's been on my list of eventually, but I have a friend that makes fun of my game plans these days and calls it the 10-year plan because I always have like grand ambitions for everything, but I only get to them like 3 years later. So.
Oh, yeah. I'm the same, but I mean, I tend to play things with a mind to writing about them, so it tends to take me quite a long time to get through a game, but I do it in order to get some articles out of them, so... Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff on my shelves that I'm not going to get to for maybe 5 or 6 years at this point, but I've got them. They're ready and waiting for me.
I bought 3 copies of Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy for a project that has been sitting there for like 2 years now, so I definitely understand that. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you again for your time, Pete.
Yeah, no problem.
Coming on the show. If you can, just kind of give another quick rundown of your website. You have a extensive amount of materials. I've definitely seen you floating around for a while, and I've been on your website, and you have a lot of content.
So for those unfamiliar, I sort of have a background of I've done a few years in sort of the professional side of things. So you might have seen my work on GamePro and US Gamer in the past. After I left US Gamer, I started MoeGamer as sort of a means of carrying on writing about the games that I love. So I've been doing it for about 5 years now. So there's I checked the other day. I think there's I've covered over 400 games now, and there's about 1,500 articles on the site. So plenty for you to explore. That's at moegamer.net. I've also got a YouTube channel as well, which you can find a link to on MoeGamer. And on there, I do a combination of things. I do some video readings of some of my articles. I also do some Let's Plays on currently the Warriors series and the Final Fantasy series. And I also do a series of retro-focused videos on there called Atari A to Z, where I look at Atari 8-bit, Atari ST, Atari 2600, and Atari 5200 games as well. So if you're into that side of things as well, do be sure to check those out as well.
How far are you into Final Fantasy at this point?
I'm probably about 3/4 of the way through Final Fantasy 2 at the minute, so...
you got a ways to go.
Yeah, way to go yet.
Yeah, I've played every mainline Final Fantasy at this point, so I'm always interested in hearing people's Final Fantasy opinions.
Yeah, I've played most of them, but I haven't finished 5 and 6 before, so that was sort of the main motivation for me. But I thought I've been meaning to play through them all in sequence for quite a while now, so I may as well make some videos out of it. So yeah, it's slow going, but I'm going to get there eventually.
How about Final Fantasy 11?
Oh yeah, I've actually already started on Final Fantasy 11. I've pre-recorded a bunch of episodes of that just in case they decide to suddenly take the game down halfway through. But yes. Yeah, I'm going to do 11 and 14 in there as well, because no one ever covers those ones in the perspective of an entire series retrospective. So, and a lot of people I know who played through 11's storyline say it's one of their favourite Final Fantasies. So I think it's important to acknowledge. It
has its ups and downs. I've played through the entire thing. And yeah, there's like Chains of Prometheia, fantastic. Yeah. Chess of Argon has some like good characters and stuff. But yeah, anyways, this isn't a Final Fantasy 11 podcast, so we're gonna be talking about this. But I'm glad you're playing it. Yeah, it's hard to get people to pay attention to that game. I'm a big I played it for like 5 years, so I was a big fan of that game, so glad you're taking time to look at it. I hope your readers and listeners like it as well. Well, cool. Well, thank you again.
Yep.
And as for my site, it's the usual stuff. Monday, I have podcasts going up at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And then Thursdays, I do my stream at 7 p.m. Pacific time. In terms of new video content, I had the Shenmue 3 quick play up on the site. So if you want to go check that out, you can. Basically, just do a quick walkthrough of my impressions of Shenmue 3. And hopefully, coming up soon, we'll have the Atokadol video, which, if you don't know, is basically a Konami arcade rhythm game. While I was in Japan, I got a chance to play a good chunk of it, and I also was able to capture some footage and stuff too. So looking forward to putting a review together for that. And I'm expecting that to probably come out early April. And that's on onecontrolreport.com. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Pete.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. Thank you. And I hope you guys have a great week. Bye.